My name is Gwen Lund, and I'm going to teach you how to make genuine whole grain sourdough bread. This is the best bread you can make on the planet. Congratulations! By watching this video, I can tell that you're open-minded and are interested in nutrition and a better bread for yourself and your family. Sourdough bread is a better bread. For years I made whole wheat bread with commercial yeast, little dry yeast packets, as the leavening, and seemed to be quite satisfied. But then I was exposed to the wonderful sourdough breads of Europe by living there for a while, and I determined that I would learn how to make it here at home in my own house. The difference is, in America, sourdough bread is generally made with white flour, then commercial yeast is used, and sometimes even vinegar is put in to make a sour taste. The bread that you will learn by watching this video is made from 4 pure ingredients and your own leavening that you make yourself. If you use the whole kernel of the wheat and you freshly grind it in your home with these wonderful little grinders that we have nowadays, you get the whole nutrition of the wheat kernel, which is probably more than 15 vitamins and minerals, so essential to the body. The reason it is called sourdough bread is because it is lacto-fermented for 7 to 9 hours, at the very most 12 hours. And if you ferment it longer than that, you'll have a more sour flavor. But normally sourdough does not have a sour flavor. Natural sourdough yeast can be eaten raw. It's good in any form, and it contains wild yeasts from the air and good bacteria from the air, just as is in your own intestine. The process of lacto-fermentation helps you to digest the bread because it is partly digested before you even eat it through the soaking process. It also neutralizes the phytates that are on the outside of the kernel, and so those are neutralized by the soaking process. So sourdough bread has many advantages, and it is very good and healthy for the body. Whole grain sourdough bread is made simply by combining fresh water, freshly ground whole wheat flour, and your starter, which is your leavening, and a little bit of salt. Simple ingredients make a marvelous bread. In your bowl, I will add 4 more cups to the 4 cups of water already in there, for a total of 8 cups. I'll add my salt and about 1/4 of a cup of sourdough starter that is you've just pulled out of your fridge. Now the sourdough starter amount in your recipe varies according to the temperature in your house or the temperature of the season. And it also varies into the altitude where you are. Sourdough rises more slowly at sea level than it does at high altitudes. So your rising times will be different. It's important to thoroughly dissolve the sourdough starter. In your bowl, you'll see bubbles in the water. Then add approximately half the flour, which would be about 9 cups of flour. And stir that together. Sourdough bread doesn't need to be kneaded. As it sits and rises, the little bubbles do the action for you through the 7 to 9 hour period. But a little bit of stirring is required. So simply incorporate your flour, moisten it, and add around 18 cups of flour. This is where the art of bread making comes in, because not all flour has the same moisture content, even in the same bag sometimes. And so you will learn to kind of get a feel through trial and error in your own kitchen how much flour to put in. But I'll try to show you here. You can see the dough still looks rather wet. You want a wet look, and it actually is, for you bread makers, a lighter dough than most commercial yeast breads. If you put too much flour in, you can always add more water. It's not fussy. But if you have too much flour in your dough, your bread will be fine, but it will dry out quickly unless you eat it right up. It'll be dry in a couple days, so. As you can see, the bread begins to form a mass in the center of the bowl. And this is just about right. The dough has formed a mass in the middle of your bowl. You can see it's rather loose, but it has lost a sheen. The ideal temperature for rising is 78 degrees. Generally, when you take cold water from your tap and combine it with warm flour that has just been ground, you get 78 degrees within a degree or two. If your dough was very cold, like you took your flour out of the freezer, then you'd want to put warm water in so that your final temperature of your dough is 78 degrees, or within a couple degrees. If you have cold dough for some reason, it will take longer to rise, and therefore you should put it in a place that is warm, and vice versa. Cover it, or it will dry out and have a crust on the top in 7 to 9 hours. Either cover it with a lid or a piece of plastic. A wet towel may dry out. I like to do my bread overnight, so I stir it up about 10 o'clock at night, and then I get up in the morning, form it into loaves, and it's completely out of the oven by 9 a.m. The kind of sourdough bread that I'm teaching you how to make is the original kind of bread that people made in Europe when the Pilgrims came over, when the pioneers crossed the plains, and they made it with the natural yeast of sourdough. Commercial yeast wasn't really developed until the late 1800s, early 1900s, and by about 1930, Wonder Bread had come into the picture. Wonder Bread is made with white flour that has been processed so that all the nutrients are gone, and then 4 synthetic vitamins and minerals are put back in. And so, in a way, we've been cheated for many years with our white breads. If you use the whole kernel of the wheat and you freshly grind it in your home with these wonderful little grinders that we have nowadays, you get the whole nutrition of the wheat kernel. The reason I changed from making whole wheat flour with my freshly ground flour and commercial yeast to the natural sourdough yeast is because the commercial yeast is not good for the body. If you eat it raw, it will grow inside your intestines. The fungi will actually attach and grow. So all of the commercial yeast has to always be cooked before you put it in your body. So you're depending on the baker to absolutely cook every bit of that yeast. If there is some left alive, then that will cause problems within the body and cause candida that we have so much trouble with today. Whether you've done it overnight or all day long, your dough will look like this. It's flattened out. It looks a little different than when you mixed it up. But at this point, you take a sturdy spoon and stir it down. You can use kind of a whipping motion to stir the dough. The bubbles will collapse, and the texture and look of the dough will change a lot. You can see the characteristic sourdough strands of gluten. So you just give it a quick full stir, maybe 10 to 15 times. The dough can be left uncovered at this point. Start your oven to preheat for about 15 minutes. The bread is baked on stones. You can get a thick one at a kitchen store for about $25, or you can get one for $2.50 at the hardware store. This is simply a porcelain tile. And because we don't know if there's lead in it, I use a parchment paper. That goes in the oven to preheat with the oven so that it's nice and hot in 15 minutes. If you were using a thicker stone, like a pizza stone, you'd have to probably preheat it for about 45 minutes. So this rests for that 15-minute period. After the 7 to 9 hour rising, your starter has also been rising, that you refreshed, and it's time now to shake it down, wipe it off, and put it in the fridge till next time. With your bread, you can stir it down another time. This will help do it, especially if you're not ready yet to shape your loaves and put them in the oven. And you will see larger bubbles in the dough and even more strands developing. Sourdough is known for its large bubbles. It's not necessary to have large bubbles in your sourdough, but it's characteristic of the dough. Water is your best friend with sourdough shaping, because with water on your hands and on the counter, the dough does not stick to your hands or counter. You also need a knife for slashing and a little cornmeal that I like to keep in a bag in the freezer sprinkled on the counter. I just keep this little cup and this frozen cornmeal in the freezer, and I just grab it when I'm ready. Make things easier. It's easy to make fresh cornmeal by just taking popcorn and running it through your wheat mill. This gives you a very nutritious product. Using a cutter of some kind, you cut off one loaf of dough, about 1/4 of the mass. Which becomes your first loaf. Placing it in the water on the counter. Gently form a round loaf. Place it in the cornmeal and slash it. Pick it up and place it in the oven on your parchment. Continue with water. Take another 1/4 of your dough, shape it in any desired shape. The reason we place it on the cornmeal is to coat the bottom of the loaf so it doesn't stick to the baking stone. Of course, these loaves can be in any shape you want, sometimes oblong, but generally I do 4 round loaves. The slicing is to help the loaf from cracking around the bottom, and it's an old world technique. Now we have the last bit of dough. This plastic is really handy, if you can find one like that, for bread making. This loaf is quite a bit smaller, but that's okay. And it goes. Set your timer for 20 minutes at the high heat. After 20 minutes, when the timer goes off, turn your heat down to 360 and finish baking for another 25 minutes, with a total of 45 minutes in the oven. As most of you cooks and bakers out there know, when you cook at lower altitudes versus higher altitudes, you have different results. I live in the Rocky Mountains, and sourdough bread is much different at sea level. At sea level, you're going to have to use some sort of form to raise your bread. Here, I just pick up my bread and put it in the oven. But there, your rising times will be slower, and you need something that will hold the shape of your bread while it's raising. These are from baskets from Austria. There's different sizes for different loaves. I think you can find baskets like this in the United States. There's even an oblong grass basket. These need to be well floured, with fresh flour every time you use them so that the dough doesn't stick to the form. But your raising time will be from, depending on your altitude, 5, 10, 15, or 20 minutes before they're ready to go in the oven. You plop them in with their top side down, and then you take the bread and put it on your peel. This is called a peel. Make sure there's cornmeal on your peel, and then you put it into the oven with a little jerk like that. Oh goody, the bread is done, and you can actually take it out. And cool on racks. A little secret. Gas ranges, racks work great as cooling racks. Another little secret is after 15 minutes on 360, you can turn off the oven and let the bread cool inside the oven. Generally, sourdough bread should be cooled several hours before you cut into it. And it's actually easier to slice the day after it's made. To make your starter from scratch, you put in a little bit of water with a little bit of organic grape juice. Grapes have natural wild yeasts on the surface of the grape, and they're very, very good fruit for starting a starter. To the grape juice and water, add some flour, little by little, until you get it about the pancake consistency. Stir it well to moisten the flour, mix it together, and lightly lid it and set it on your counter somewhere out of the way. I like to start with about 1/2 cup in my jar, depending on how big your jar is. And as you add over the next 4 or 5 days, a little bit of flour and water each day, you will increase your amount. What happens with the sourdough starter is the microbes begin to grow because you fed it the flour. And yeast develops from the air, a wild yeast. So it's okay to leave your jar open, and when you go to bed at night, you could close it to make sure it's safe while you're away. Our starter has set for a day, and we need to feed it. You can add 1/2 cup to 1/3 cup of flour and about the same amount of water. I like to keep my starter at a loose dough consistency, because if you put too much flour in it, it becomes like a bread dough, and you tend to develop the gluten. And once you get the gluten going in your starter, it's a little hard to work into your water. Sourdough in your kitchen is actually microbes in your kitchen. If you're the kind of person that likes to use a lot of chemicals on your cupboards and bar, you're going to have a harder time developing a sourdough starter because you're constantly killing those. But you want this friendly bacteria and wild yeast in your kitchen, and the more you make sourdough in your kitchen, the easier it is to make sourdough. For me, in my kitchen, I've been making sourdough things for years. My sourdough starter is ready in about 2 days from scratch. But for most of you, it will take 4 to 5 of feeding it every day, once a day, and stirring it. You know when it's ready to use, when there are bubbles, lots of bubbles. It's a very frothy, bubbly mixture, and when left at room temperature, after it stirs down, it raises again to the top of your jar very quickly. Within a few hours, you'll know that it's strong enough to raise your bread. When you leave the starter in your fridge at such a thin consistency, it's about the consistency of pancake dough, it tends to separate, and after 2 weeks this will turn kind of brown with exposure to the air. There's nothing wrong with that. Just stir it in. It's all just fine. It's a little microcosm of activity, and it stays nicely covered in the fridge. Just feed it, because it will eat itself and starve. There are many variations that you can make with this same bread dough. The first one we're going to do is pumpkin seed bread. I've soaked the seeds overnight, about 8 to 10 hours. This is very important, that you soak the pumpkin seed in water to cover itself completely. If you don't do that, you're going to have very hard seeds in your bread that will not be good at all. You take a regular size loaf off your mass, place it in the water, and to this you're going to add most of the pumpkin seeds you've soaked. Now this can be to taste. Leave a few in your colander and knead these in. We like them really thick, so you get a lot of that great pumpkin seed flavor. These are hulled pumpkin seeds. When you've mixed them in well, you dip the top of the loaf into the remaining pumpkin seeds, so you have a nice amount of pumpkin on the top, and that's ready to go in your oven. The next one is cinnamon swirl bread. It's like a big cinnamon roll. You take whatever size loaf you want to make. This could even be roll size too. And you spread it out like you do cinnamon rolls. In this pan I've combined 1/4 of a cup of butter, 1/2 a cup of sugar, brown sugar. I actually use sucanat, and about 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. And I melted that together. I'm just going to pour that on there. Spread it out. And sprinkle raisins if you want. And I'm just going to swirl this together. And I'm using a parchment this time, a bread pan with a piece of parchment in it, just because the swirl bread tends to leak and get all over your stone and make a mess. And I sprinkled the cornmeal in there and placed my loaf in the pan. And that goes in the oven. The cinnamon swirl bread is done, nicely browned. You can take it out of with the parchment and let it cool. For scones, we sprinkle a little flour on the table. Take out a small amount of dough. Put flour on your hands and bring your scone out to fry it. If you used water, your water would combine with the grease on the stove and spatter. You can let it raise for a few minutes at this point. This is going to be cooked on the stove in a little bit of oil in a pan. Take this over to the pan where you've heated the oil and let it sizzle. After it's cooked with on one side for a while, turn over with a fork and let it cook until it's cooked through. When it's completely done, drain on a paper towel. Next is focaccia, made on a cookie sheet with a little bit of oil, olive oil on the bottom. Take out probably a small size loaf of dough. Oil your hands. Turn your dough over once to coat it and spread it out like pizza dough. The traditional focaccia from Italy is always made with a tree, the trunk, the leaves, this actually opens up the dough for baking. To this you sprinkle a little bit of garlic powder, a little bit of oregano, and put it in the oven at a nice high heat. I've just taken the focaccia out. The focaccia actually baked 15 to 20 minutes, and it's done when the around is kind of brown. It will reabsorb all the olive oil that was on the sides when you took it out, and it's ready for eating right now. These next two variations are done on a cloth. This is just a canvas that I've hemmed. It's actually large, but I folded it over. And this keeps your dough from sticking to the table, even though you have flour, sometimes it does. So for a pita, take a small walnut size, large walnut size, and sprinkle it with a little bit of flour, or turn the flour turned over. Take your rolling pin, put a little flour on it, and roll it out to be about the pita size you want. This is your typical pita bread, and it will pop up in the oven with a pocket. It's also called pocket bread. That's what it should look like. You take this and lay it on your hot stone in your oven. And for pita bread, the hotter you can get your oven, the better. If you lay it on your stone and then make it round again. The whole grain flour tortilla is made very similar to the pita. Only roll it out a little thinner. And you fry it on the stove on a griddle or large frying pan. Of course, you can make it any size you want. Try to get it as round as possible. You can use plenty of flour, but it should be like 1/8 of an inch thick when you're done. You just lift it up, take it over, and place it on your griddle. It will cook very quickly. Bubbles will form a little bit, and then you can turn it over once. When it's done, you can flip it on one side anyway. You flip it over to cook a little bit on the other. For 3 or 4 minutes on each side, the tortilla is done. Place it on a plate with a napkin, and as you make your stack of tortillas, put another napkin in between, and that helps to keep it from drying out. It's a whole wheat tortilla, ready to be filled with your favorite goodies. For the breadsticks, I melted about 1/8 of a cup of butter on a cookie sheet with sides and sprinkled sesame seeds on it, onto the melted butter. You could use poppy seed or any other small seed you like for breadsticks. You'll want to use generous amounts of water on this one. Pushing out your dough, and then cutting it into sticks. These you can lay on the sesame seeds and butter and roll them. Rolling each one so they don't stick to each other, but let the sides touch so you can fill up your whole pan. Continue to fill your whole pan, and in a few minutes you'll have yummy breadsticks. You can put the breadsticks in immediately after you form them, but I'm going to let them rise because our oven is quite full at the moment. Just 2 to 3 minutes. Here are the breadsticks, nice and toasty. Next I'm going to show you how to make individual cinnamon rolls. You can put them in any size pan, or you could put them on a cookie sheet separated from one another. Start by making your dough into a square with well wet fingers so that you don't stick, and then spread melted butter on this, or you can use just soft butter and spread it with a knife. To this add cinnamon and brown sugar, or any kind of sweetener that you want. You could even use molasses, sucanat, whatever. Sprinkle with cinnamon. You can also add mace if you like that flavor. And then with wet hands, roll up your dough into a log. Slice, generous slices, or use this. Put them in your pan just touching. A nice big one there in the middle. Let that raise maybe for 5 minutes and then place it in the oven. This is crackers. You make it on the back of the cookie sheet. Grease it with butter and sprinkle it with a little cornmeal and flour. Thoroughly getting the flour and cornmeal on there. It's about a cup of dough. Have your flour handy so you can keep sprinkling flour on the top so it doesn't stick to your It helps to have a little something to keep it from moving. And you're just going to roll this out and off the edges of the pan. Because the point is to get it as thin as possible. A nice thin cracker is what you want. And just get this as thin as you possibly can. With a pizza cutter, cut off the extra dough, or a knife. At this point you can sprinkle it with a little bit of sesame seed. And roll that in to the dough. Score with your pizza cutter into the desired size of cracker. And bake at about 450 to 460. I cut straight across, and then I cut on a diagonal to get a diagonal shaped cracker. These go in the oven for about 15 minutes until their edges are lightly browned, and then just turn off the oven and let them crisp in the oven. They will become totally crispy. Here's a fresh loaf of sourdough bread. If you want more of a sheen on top, you can spray water with a spray gun on the loaves as they bake. Generally, I like to slice it in half. Give this half to a friend. And slice it in half slices. This bread is delicious, nutritious, and I hope you'll try it with your family.